Hello and welcome to the Straits Times webinar, The A to Z of COVID-19 Vaccines. I'm Salma Khalid, Senior Health Correspondent at the Straits Times. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong announced recently that Singapore will start vaccination of healthcare workers and vulnerable elderly by the end of this year. There will be enough vaccines for everyone here by the third quarter of next year. This has led to a surge of hope that it may spell the end of the pandemic and life can return to normal. But is that really true? With me today are three experts who can tell us more about these vaccines and what they mean to us. Professor Lim Poh Lian, to my right, is the Director of the High-Level Isolation Unit at the National Centre for Infectious Diseases. She also heads the Travellers Health and Vaccination Clinic at Tan Tock Seng Hospital, and she is a member of the COVID-19 Vaccine Expert Committee. Next to me, Professor Ooi Eng Eong of Duke-NUS Medical School specializes in emerging diseases. He is also the principal investigator of a COVID-19 vaccine that had early-stage trials conducted in Singapore. And on my far right, Mr. Ashish Pal is the Managing Director of pharmaceutical giant Merck Sharp Dohme for Singapore and Malaysia. He's a pharmacist by training, but today he represents the Singapore Association of Pharmaceutical Industries as its president. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today. Now, the best vaccine is one that is safe, highly effective against infection and not just disease, needs only to be given once, and protects people for life. Poh Lian, as the COVID-19 Vaccine Expert Committee member here, the committee must have grappled with these issues. Looking at 3 vaccines that Singapore has bought, how many of these criteria do these vaccines fulfill?
Well, the Pfizer vaccine has been given authorization for use in Singapore by the HSA, the Health Sciences Authority. So the expert committee on COVID vaccination has reviewed the Pfizer's vaccine safety and efficacy and for different population segments. And we've been briefed by HSA on its full range of considerations in giving pandemic special access route authorization for use in Singapore.
Right.
We are satisfied that it has met the criteria to be highly effective and safe for use.
But is it a one jab for life, or do we not know yet?
Oh, the vaccine is 2 doses, and for the Pfizer vaccine, it's 3 weeks or 21 days apart. Let's be honest, most vaccines require more than 1 dose.
Right.
I mean, if you think about the usual sort of childhood vaccines or even adult vaccines like hepatitis B, they're often 2 or 3 or 4 doses even. So for long-term protection and for the best protection, we will need to complete 2 doses of the vaccine for that highly effective protection. The vaccine has also received authorization, interim authorization, in a number of other countries, including the US and UK and Canada.
Right, so it has been accepted by quite a few countries now.
Yeah.
But the UK government mentioned something about the Pfizer vaccine. They're not sure about the impact on fertility. That sounds a bit worrying. Should younger people perhaps avoid it? Eng Eong, would you like to take that?
Sure. No, I think there are a lot of studies that we need to do for vaccines before we can say that it can be used. For instance, whether a vaccine can be used during pregnancy, whether it can be used in children, and how young can you go before, where the limits are. But everything essentially has to be guided by data. It doesn't mean that just because the studies have not been done, therefore it cannot be used or it will be unsafe. And that's what I think the UK authorities are saying, that the studies to show that the vaccines can be used safely in people who are planning for pregnancy or are already pregnant, those studies have not been completed.
Right.
So, but it doesn't mean that it's not safe, that it will cause sterility. It does not mean that at all. In fact, the one property of this mRNA vaccine is that it actually cannot spread. And that is why you need more than 1 dose. For instance, once we get infected with, say, a virus like dengue or measles, we are immune for life.
Okay.
But why is it then that we have to give multiple doses of the same the vaccine against these viruses? And the answer is because the amount of viral proteins that we make in the body or that's put in a vaccine is not the same as what an infectious virus would produce. And so because of that, the effect on our body and the way it disseminates and all that spreads to the other parts of the body is very different from a live infection. And so mRNA vaccine cannot spread, and that's why you need multiple doses.
Cannot spread means it's safer, is it?
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely, yeah. So, for me, I don't think that, in terms of the biology of mRNA and what we have seen so far with all the preclinical studies, I think in all intents and purposes, it is a very safe vaccine.
Well, you should know because you yourself are working on an mRNA vaccine, right?
Yes.
Poh Lian, as a doctor, so if somebody comes to you and a young couple, for example, what's your advice to them? Should they take the vaccine or should they wait a while?
Well, I think, we're going to start by vaccinating those at highest risk. So healthcare workers, frontline workers, and those who are more vulnerable because of age or because of medical conditions. So that young couple probably would not be in the first or second groups. But if I was answering the question as a doctor, the reality is most vaccines that we give do not affect people's fertility. Think about it. Hepatitis A, hepatitis B, tetanus, pertussis, etc. So it'd be very, very unusual and very unlikely that this vaccine would actually cause any problems with fertility. So I think that the issue is that there is no data, and so we're being very cautious. It's in our DNA to be sort of kiasu.
Right.
And so until the data comes, we're probably going to say, hold off until we get more data, because we want to do this as safely as possible. But I don't think on the basis of, my experience with vaccines, that there's any reason why this vaccine would have any problems with fertility, but we just don't have the data yet.
Right. How long will it take normally for such data to come up? Ashish, you are in the pharmaceutical company. How long does it normally take for these things to emerge?
Yeah, so, if you think about the whole process of vaccines development, typically in the pharmaceutical industry, as my fellow panelists are well aware, it's a long process of development. Vaccines can take 8 to 10 years to develop. I think COVID-19 has clearly demonstrated the agility and the innovation that thrives across the industry. And I think, data comes over years, as my panelists would agree. So I think it depends on the studies that are being done, and the data will be released over a period of time and shared in parallel with the regulatory agencies.
Actually, could I just pick up on something
Sure.
you just said, right? It normally takes 8 to 10 years for a vaccine to be developed and come onto the market. In fact, I think the record is your mum's vaccine, 4 years, and it hit the market. This time, we have got vaccines coming up in under a year. How did the pharmaceutical industry manage to do something so quickly?
Yep. No, I think that's a great question, and I think if we think about COVID-19 and we think about what COVID-19 has done for the world, in addition to, of course, unprecedented grief and suffering and economic contractions and job losses, I think there is a flip element to it, and that is tremendous innovation and agility it has unleashed across the world. The biopharmaceutical industry has really come together like probably never before. And I speak for all of our member companies at SAPI to collaborate, to engage, to work closely with academia, to work closely with each other, and to take very, very thoughtful but calculated, bold risks. And the risks are not compromising on safety, not compromising on obviously what is paramount to our industry and to the medical community and to patients at large, which is safety.
So you are saying that the speed does not affect safety?
No, because if you look at the pledge that our industry has taken and our members have taken, it has always been a science-first strategy, and science first, never at the cost of safety of the product. Safety is paramount to what we do in the biopharmaceutical space.
Eng Eong, you yourself are involved, right?
Yes.
So
yeah. I can add to that. I think what Ashish said is exactly right. But not beyond that, I think what tends to happen in the past or in peacetime in between epidemics is that the studies are usually done one after another. Right. So that if it fails, then you can say, okay, I'll stop this program without incurring the cost of all the downstream studies. But given the situation of COVID-19, then what happens is that most people now try and parallel process these studies. So you do it at risk, right? At the cost of the companies, the developers.
Does it raise the cost a lot?
Yes. Well, if it fails. If it fails, because you're already committed to these studies, right? And then if you now decide that You know, like for example, the University of Queensland decided that they will stop the vaccine, but they've already done a lot of studies, right? And you know, that's the price that we're paying. But it's not at the expense of cutting corners. I think that has to be stressed. There's been no corners that have been cut.
Right, so you are essentially, the two of you are saying that it's because they're putting in a lot of money, that there's a lot more cooperation between academia and researchers and commercial entities, that the thing has been able to be done at warp speed.
And I think I agree, and I think to the points that were made, I think it's not just studies done in parallel, but if you think about the process of commercialization, and you start with development and you get to commercialization, there are many steps along the way, including manufacturing. Pharmaceutical companies have really embraced the challenge and have, to the point that was made earlier, not just looked at doing studies in parallel, but also manufactured before getting approvals and often before getting data. So this is why you see such a short cycle time from the point of approval to the point of supply.
That's a massive risk, isn't it? There are about 200 vaccine candidates, and probably not all of them will make it to the market.
Absolutely, and that comes back to the point that was being made, which is testament to what our industry has done, taking bold, calculated risks. And for those vaccine candidates that are successful and are safe, effective, and can be commercialized, you've got a scenario, but there will be many more, unfortunately, with over 150 candidates in preclinical and clinical development that will unfortunately fail.
Right.
But I would also add that it's not just so the pharmaceutical industry. I think the scientific communities around the world have really mobilized around this challenge. And it also takes a lot of political will in terms of governments and regulatory authorities to go ahead and sort of look at this stuff in an expedited way. But the other part is also a function of the outbreak itself, which is that, you know, we've got 60 million people infected worldwide. And in a way, when you're developing a vaccine in response to an outbreak, sometimes the outbreak, you know, comes and then it goes. So if you think about SARS, it's been 17 years since that outbreak happened, and we still don't have a commercially available vaccine for that, neither for MERS, which has been around for 8 years, because the numbers of people infected did not allow us to go ahead and test the vaccine in a, you know, compelling and, you know, convincing way. So the fact that the vaccine is being deployed, that the outbreak has gone on for this many months, and that there are actually hundreds of thousands of people who are currently exposed, has actually allowed the companies to get to the endpoint that was pre-specified as part of rigorous biostatistical scientific evidence, to say that we get to 170 cases, and in the case of the Pfizer vaccine, 162 of them were in the placebo group, and 8 cases were in the vaccinated group. But if you were to try to do that same test in Singapore, you might not get that number because we're not seeing community transmission.
Right. Actually, can I move to Eng Eong? I believe you've got a chart you want to share with us.
Yeah, we could go through that data.
Tell us.
Yeah.
So this is a data taken from Pfizer-BioNTech's phase 3 clinical trial. It just got published in New England Journal of Medicine just a few days ago. And what you see are 2 lines. The blue line are those that received placebo, and the red line are those that received the vaccine. The vaccine is given in 2 doses, so at day 0 and then at day 21. So as Poh Lian and you know, we have just now discussed that, you know, most vaccines need multiple doses. But what's really interesting to see here is that you start to see an effect after 12 days, and so they blew up that bottom part.
Before you go on, these dots here, these are the people who got infected?
Yes, cases.
Right, okay, these are the real cases.
So each dot represents a case. And so the, now ideally, technically the 8 cases that Poh Lian referred to was after the 2nd dose, right? Because the vaccine was meant to be given as 2 doses. But what you can see here is that even after 1 dose, there's already an effect. The effect takes 12 days before it starts to occur, and that's entirely consistent with the time the immune system needs to respond to a vaccine. Because it needs to develop a memory, that it needs to see this and develop antibodies or develop T cells, and that takes about 2 weeks. And so that's exactly what you're seeing here, that at about 2 weeks, you start to see a separation in the 2 lines. That tells you that this vaccine works, right? It's not because of some, you know, non-specific stimulation of the immune response. If that was so, then the line would have split at day 1, day 2, and then start to climb again at around day 28 or something like that. That tells you it's a non-specific response.
Okay.
Right? Whereas here, everything is pointing towards a very specific immune response against the virus, and that seems to protect even after a single dose. Now, of course, this is not there's no evidence to suggest that this is a single dose vaccine, because although the protection starts early, how long it's sustained for, we don't know.
Right.
As a trial, at least tells us that with 2 doses, you can at least have a 2 to 3 month protection. But looking at the line, that is probably the protection is probably going to be longer than that because of the separation between the blue and the red. But it basically, I think we can be confident that the vaccine is working the way we intend it to work.
Right, which brings me then to another question, right? Pfizer has asked Britain, and I believe other countries that have bought it early, for an indemnity clause. Now, that's not usual, is it, Ashish?
Well, actually, I wouldn't respond to a specific company, but really talk about a little bit more around, take a step back and talk around what are governments striving to do around the world. And I think my fellow panelists alluded to the collaboration, which has been very significant between industry, academia, and governments. You really want to get to a point where you have a very, very effective use of your resources, people and dollar, so that vaccines are actually administered and populations start to acquire immunity. To achieve that, you want to look at 2 different mechanisms in place: indemnity mechanisms and no-fault compensation mechanisms. This is not new to COVID-19 vaccines. There are countries around the world, including 9 in the Asia-Pacific region, that have indemnity clauses and no-fault compensation clauses for vaccinations in general.
Why? Because it seems to imply that the company doesn't have enough faith in its own vaccine.
Actually, it's quite the contrary. It's a reflection of the robustness and the confidence of the vaccine registration and approval process that the authorities have for that country. Obviously, a reflection of the work that the company or the companies have done to bring this vaccine to market. And so if you think about it, the indemnity clauses are protecting governments, distributors, administrators, and providers, right? And the no-fault compensation mechanisms are protecting patients. So you want to create an environment where people feel protected and people feel empowered to go ahead and ask for a vaccine and get the vaccine administered.
How do I feel protected? I mean, Poh Lian, as a doctor, if people ask you, right? The company says, I'm not taking responsibility if anything happens. How do I feel protected?
Well, the way I would answer that is, if we vaccinate people, there are small but known risks, right? But if we don't vaccinate people, people will also get hurt. So it's not a matter of saying, if I do nothing, we're okay. The weighing is really not between the vaccine and nothing, but the vaccine and the disease. And so, in a way, by allowing those kinds of clauses in place, for example, when you think about things like polio, when we vaccinate with polio, there is still a 1 in a million chance that you can have a vaccine-associated polio paralysis. Whereas if you didn't vaccinate against polio, before the polio eradication started, we had 350,000 people a year with polio. So in a way, by allowing people to say, no, it's not the fault of the vaccine. So we're not, indemnifying manufacturers necessarily against, bad work. Right. We're saying that the vaccine itself has certain intrinsic risks. And by acknowledging that intrinsic risk, we are allowing the benefit of the vaccine to be made to the whole population, and not necessarily putting fear and a defensive sort of litigious kind of climate to stop the vaccination process.
Right. So essentially you're saying the risk is very small and may affect a very, very small number of people, but the number of people who will benefit from it is huge.
Yeah. Yeah. And to be afraid to do it just because you're afraid of that very small risk will then actually harm a lot more people by not getting vaccinated.
Right. But could you explain a little bit more about, there have been recent cases of reactions to the vaccine. How dangerous is it? There was one case where the person has no known allergies, and then a healthcare worker in New York, and she still reacted badly. But I think her outcome was good because they monitored her. So how serious is this problem?
Well, I think it's going to be a hard thing because we are starting to see the rollout around the world. But we know in general that vaccines are like medications. You know, all medications can potentially cause allergies or even anaphylaxis, which is the more serious form with hypersensitivity, can happen immediately. Anaphylaxis is typically where people have difficulty breathing, the blood pressure may fall. People can actually die of this severe allergy, kind of allergic reaction to a medication or a vaccine. Typically it happens with things like penicillin. But if you think about it, even though we've known about, anaphylaxis with penicillin, we don't stop using penicillin. We just have to know that it can happen and be prepared for it to manage the patient safely. So the same is going to be true for vaccines. Now, we are actually putting a precaution in place. The expert committee has sort of looked at the information that's coming in from overseas to say that, people with serious anaphylactic reactions before this may want to hold off and on getting the COVID vaccine. So that's perfectly valid because we are trying to be safe. But when we give the vaccine, even someone without a reaction could have a reaction. And we're going to be putting those safety things in place.
Actually, I think the warning was that anybody who has allergic reactions. So what is an allergic reaction? Because you have serious ones and you have mild ones. I'm allergic to something and then I get a bit of an itch, or I'm allergic to seafood and suddenly I can't breathe. So
yes.
Which of these people should not take the vaccine?
The serious allergies. So we usually define serious allergies as people who have swelling around the mouth, the eyes, or the face, difficulty breathing, or if they really did experience a very serious drop in blood pressure. And it's usually to a specific thing, whether it's a bee sting or a medication or, in this case, potentially vaccines.
Right. Maybe you should take over because Poh Lian's talking too much. I think she's feeling a bit exhausted. Who else should not take this vaccine? Are there people, I think they talk about immunocompromised people. Who else should not take the vaccine?
Well, I think in the clinical trial itself, they've really taken into account that the vaccine needs to work in those who are at risk of severe COVID-19. So actually, one of the things that they were very careful to include into the trial are people with, cardiac problems, with cancer and all that, right? High blood pressure, diabetes, everything. Those were included. And for that reason, there were deaths in the trial, but they died because they had all these other chronic diseases, not because of the vaccine, right? And so that kind of creates some issue or a concern when people looked at it. Well, 6 people died in the trial. Well, actually only 2 in the vaccine arm, but 4 in the placebo arm. But they died because they had all these chronic conditions before they even received the vaccine. So in that sense, then whatever that the trial managed to include, then we know that the data points towards safety. Now, of course, there are those that were not included, including young children below 16 years old, right? And I believe pregnancy was excluded as well. Yes, pregnancy was excluded. So some of those things, therefore, means that there is no data. Now, given, and I think Poh Lian rightly said, right, it's a question of risk and benefit. If, let's say, Singapore has a massive second wave right now, I would say go ahead and take it, because if you don't, then you're going to get COVID-19 and complications are going to be worse than... Even if you're pregnant, complications from COVID would be worse than complications from... Well, pregnancy maybe not, but certainly if let's say I'm a young adult and I'm planning to have a family, okay, so there's no, like I said earlier, the studies for fertility may not have been finished, but I would go ahead and take it, given the science and what we know about the vaccine. There's no indication that it will cause infertility, right. It's just that there's no data about the subject. Right. Exactly. So at the end of the day, it's risk-benefit. Now, given that Singapore has no domestic transmission right now, then if you choose to say, okay, I'll wait for the data, I think that's sensible. On that, since Singapore's transmission is so low, is there a need to rush our vaccination? Should we not just wait a few months, see what happens in Britain and the US and other places, see if it throws up more information before Singapore goes into our vaccination?
Well, I would say that you make a very good case to wait, but the challenge is really that we're starting to open up. And the truth is that, when you look at the world, the pandemic is raging in lots of countries. And so if you think about it, a book that you don't read is just a block of wood, highly processed and expensive. A vaccine that you don't use, it's like, if you bought a Norton antivirus because you heard that there was some malware going around, but you didn't open it or take it out of the packaging. The vaccine is not useful unless we actually deploy it. And so the challenge is really that if you don't take the vaccine, then you're not protected. And if Singapore should get hit by a second wave, then the health systems and the public health systems will be busy, and it will be much harder to mount a response to vaccinate a lot of people in the middle of a second wave, because there'll be safe distancing and so on. But the other part is also that the vaccine takes 2 shots, and it can take up to 5 weeks for the full immunity and protection to kick in. So in a way, it's really important to think about getting the vaccine now, because most of our cases are actually imported cases. And every single imported case could actually spark a cluster.
Right.
So it's really a way of protecting the community.
So you're saying that if I wait and there is another outbreak and I get vaccinated, then I wouldn't be protected for several weeks?
Well, it would take, as Eng Eong had said, the protection starts fairly soon after the first dose, but it's not full protection.
Right.
And we often know that 2-dose vaccines are required for durable, long-term protection. So, even if the outbreak started now and you started getting the vaccine today, your full protection will not happen till at least 5 weeks out.
Right.
I think to add to what Poh Lian said, even if we have stockpiled enough vaccines to cover the entire Singapore population, rolling out the vaccine takes time, right? You cannot say, oh, I want to be vaccinated today, I will get my vaccine today. It doesn't always work that way. It depends on, how many people are in the queue and whether, there's enough capacity to, essentially there's a limited number of people that can be vaccinated in one day. So if we wait until an epidemic hits us and then say, okay, now I want a vaccine, while you may not be in line in time.
So I may be 1 month away from my turn.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And even if you could get it today.
Exactly. And not only that, but I think, although there are no cases in Singapore, Singapore is paying a very heavy price for having this no case. And the price comes in the context of our economic growth, right? And so, although we may not have cases, a lot of people are affected by the control measures against COVID-19. Now, a vaccine allows us to open up, various parts of the economy. Then, we alleviate the burden on a lot of people who, although may not have disease, but are badly affected by the control measures.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just add a perspective, I think what we're seeing today is, as very correctly pointed out, it's because we are essentially shielded from the rest of the world and countries around us. If you think about the economic contraction this has had around the world, I think the only way to kind of start to get this process moving and get the world back in order is to allow the free movement of people. And Singapore heavily relies as a leading biopharmaceutical hub, but a leading business hub for the free movement of travel, both in and out of Singapore. So if we want to really start to, in addition to the terrific measures that have been in place, which have allowed us to get to this point, find a way to accelerate a resumption of continued economic revival and growth as a key player globally and in the Southeast Asia region, I think earlier vaccinations would probably be a prudent thing to do.
Are you saying that, if enough people here get vaccinated, we can throw away our masks, forget about social distancing, never mind 5 people or 8 people, open up, go traveling? No? Poh Lian is saying no?
No. Well, I think, we are still starting to look at the impact of vaccinations on transmission. So the case has been, made that it does protect against COVID disease, but whether it protects against sterilizing immunity, provides sterilizing immunity, that someone who has the vaccine cannot transmit, that's still not necessarily known. I think it's possible that it will drop the risk of transmission because someone who's not coughing and sneezing probably will spread it less. But we still don't know. So we're going to have to keep those measures in place as the evidence comes in. So masks continue, safe gathering measures, and so on. But I think that as the world tries to open up, it will actually be helpful to drop the risk of transmission, and we think that the vaccines will make a big difference.
Can I just ask you a little bit more on that? So you say it protects against the disease, but which means if I get COVID-19, I don't get sick, but I can still pass the virus on to other people. Is that essentially what you're saying? It's
possible. We think it's less likely, but the data are not in yet.
So may I can add to that.
Yes.
So before getting into the clinical trial, we had to do a lot of animal studies.
Right.
Now, in all these vaccines, what we've found in the animal studies is that if in a vaccinated animal, they don't get lung disease. So they're completely free, they don't get the pneumonia. But you can still find the virus in the airway.
Oh.
So in other words, you can still get infected in the upper airway, but not get the severe COVID-19, right? And that in itself is beneficial to society because the reason for that is because the COVID-19 is a problem because of patients ending up in the ICU needing ventilators, and in places where you run out of ICU beds, run out of ventilators, then there's not much you can do for the patient, right? And that's why you have high fatality rates. If you can reduce the number of patients, then around the world we will be able to cope with severe COVID-19. Now, I think Poh Lian is also right saying that for the virus, staying in the airway of a person is useless. They need to come out because they have a limited time before even in the airway, upper airway, the immune system will get rid of it. They need to come out to get into another host because that's all about survival for the virus, right? So if you don't cough, you don't sneeze, then the chance of the virus coming out is very, very small.
I thought they say even when you talk, it can go more than 2 meters.
Well, it's not a yes/no answer. It's the extent, the probability, right? So it's more. You have to think of it in terms of quantitative rather than qualitative, right? It's how much.
Right.
So if you're coughing and sneezing, your chance of spreading is much higher than if you're just talking or singing, right?
Right.
So and I think although there is no data, I think from the preliminary thing that I've heard, at least in the clinical trial, there is some reduction in the viral load, even in the upper airway in these vaccinated individuals. So, not everything in animals will translate to humans, and so everything, the acid test is still going to be in the clinical trial, but there's just not enough time for the clinical trial to really test the question whether a vaccine can prevent infection. All we can do now, or can be certain now, is that it can prevent disease.
Right. So if it cannot prevent infection, even though the viral load is low and the transmission may be lower, it means that we can't get herd immunity in the country because those who are vaccinated are protected, but those who are not vaccinated cannot be protected just because everybody else has been vaccinated.
The herd immunity question is very straightforward if you have sterilizing immunity.
Right.
Okay, then the math is very simple. It's 1 minus 1 divided by R naught, right?
Sorry, can you explain that a little bit, please?
So we know now that R naught, or R0, R naught, is the number that tells you how infectious this virus is. And we know now that it's about 3. If you don't control this disease, it's about 3.
So one person can infect 3, roughly, okay?
Yep. So if you want to stop SARS coronavirus 2 from being transmitted, is 1 minus 1 over 3. In other words, 2/3 of the population, as long as there's sterilizing immunity, you're done. That's it.
Right.
There's no more epidemic, right? Now, because we don't know that, what would mean is that we may have to vaccinate more than 2/3. But because of the reduced transmission from vaccination, because there's less cough and all that, right? I think you would still achieve herd immunity. It's just that the number isn't 2/3. You may need 80, 90%. So, but I think if enough people are eventually vaccinated, I think we can get back to normal.
Yeah, what worries me are people who may be immunocompromised. Does this include people who are on dialysis, for example? Because Singapore has thousands of people with kidney failure who are on dialysis. Can they take the vaccine?
I think eventually we can get there. It's just that right now, like I said, we will eventually want to vaccinate children because children tend to play with grandparents and looked after by grandparents even, right? So you want to vaccinate children so that the chance of re-exposure to the virus amongst the elderly is reduced. But it's just that because of how fast this thing has happened, these trials have naturally focused on the more vulnerable population first. But the plan would, of course, eventually be to cover the rest of the population not currently covered by phase 3 trial. I think eventually, and that also brings up the point that we cannot rest on the laurels and say, okay, we've got 2 or 3, possibly 3 vaccines, that's it, we can stop the rest. Because you need the rest to come through to make sure that at least even if Pfizer's or Moderna's vaccine cannot be used in the immunocompromised population, something like that, then eventually there will be a vaccine that can be used in those populations.
Right. So some of those that are not on the market yet may be better for certain groups of people.
Right.
So they should not stop their
Exactly.
work. Right.
Exactly.
But on the herd immunity front, I would like to say that herd immunity is helpful as a number, but I think it's a little bit of a mistake to focus on that. Because on the expert committee, we have basically recommended that as comprehensive a coverage should be done. We would like to vaccinate as many people who are eligible as possible, as long as they're willing to do it. It is voluntary. So the reason for that is because herd immunity helps prevent sort of an out-of-control outbreak in the community. But what it doesn't prevent is if you, for example, came home from a trip overseas and you had a vulnerable elderly parent or a family member at home that was unvaccinated, it might not spread it in the whole community, but that family member who's vulnerable could still get infected from you. So in a way, by having enough people who are vaccinated, you will be unable, in a sense, to bring it home to the people that you care about. So we want to make sure that we vaccinate as many people as possible, rather than relying on that concept of herd immunity.
Right.
Because there will be people who cannot take it, and there will be people who, even if they get the vaccine, their immune systems are less good and they can't mount enough of a protection or response to the vaccine. And in that sense, when enough people take it, then we'll drop the amount of infections bouncing around, and they're less likely to stop a bullet, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah, it's. I mean, the idea is the herd immunity idea is to stop an epidemic. It doesn't mean that you will have 0 cases. That's elimination or eradication.
Right.
So how we got rid of smallpox was that because of this number, you calculated that you needed to vaccinate 80% of the population. So that's what WHO did. Vaccinated 80% of the global population. And then wherever you have epidemics, they went around and ring vaccinated everyone that came in contact with the case. That's how eventually they eradicated smallpox, right? But eradication, elimination is a much higher hurdle than stopping an epidemic.
Right. Now, Singapore has already bought 3 different brands of vaccines, and Mr. Gan Kim Yong, our health minister, said Singapore is in negotiation to buy a few more. So let's just look at the 3 that we bought. Pfizer has been approved and given interim approval for use in Singapore. Moderna seems to be on the cusp of getting approval in the US, but Sinovac has yet to release its phase 3 trial results. So would the expert committee actually recommend using all 3 of these vaccines?
Well, the expert committee will rely upon HSA authorizing the vaccines to be for interim use based upon the pandemic special access route. So what it means is that we understand that these vaccines are still being, the data is still coming in, but it will be based upon phase 3 trials data. And the phase 3 trials usually require at least 30,000 subjects in the arm, usually randomized half to each side, half to vaccine, half to placebo. So at this point, it's really important to wait for those companies to actually file the application with the regulatory authorities like Health Sciences Authority of Singapore. And we also take reference from the international bodies. There are a bunch of benchmark regulatory authorities like in the US and so on. But we will wait for the HSA review, which is usually very meticulous, before making a recommendation about using it because safety is the most important thing.
So you're saying that we may have bought them, we may have them in the warehouse, but if HSA does not give approval, nobody here is going to be given that vaccine.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily bought. I think there are advanced purchase agreements. But I'm sure our government has got all kinds of clauses. So, you wouldn't want to buy a pig in a poke. But the reason that there are these is because, as with the COVAX facility, when you are, in a sense, backing a horse, as you know, there are about 200 candidates, so you don't know which horse will win.
Yes.
So in some ways, if you really want to make sure that your population has something, you may have to back different horses. So I'm sure those kinds of advanced purchase agreements, which are outside, above my job grade, have those kinds of clauses in place.
Right. So you may not win all of them, but at least because of the advanced purchase agreement, you will get some.
Yes, we will not be at the back of the queue. We
Right.
hope that we have something for Singaporeans.
The current vaccine, how long is the protection for? Is it going to be like the flu vaccine where you may need to be vaccinated every year? In fact, I believe the flu vaccine, since you're in Travelers Clinic, you would be the expert on it. Protection is 6 months, 8 months, depending on the age group of the person and the type of vaccines. So if that's the same with the COVID-19 vaccine, does it mean that by third quarter, when everybody has got the vaccines, you have to start all over again to vaccinate the entire population?
It's a really good question, but I think you have to look at the actual virus, and of course Eng Eong is the real virologist here. But flu virus mutates at a pretty decent rate, and the reason we actually have to vaccinate people for flu every year is because of the continued mutations.
Right.
There's antigenic drift and shift. But from what we know of SARS-CoV-2, the mutation rate for that virus is much less. And so we don't know yet. There are a lot of unknowns, but I think it's not as likely that we would need to go into yearly vaccinations. In fact, I think it's unlikely that we'll probably have to do that. But the true duration of protection is still to be, we're still waiting for the data.
Right. In fact, I believe your colleague, Professor Wang Linfa, talks about the original SARS.
Yes.
People who had them are still
Yes.
protected, but that's natural protection.
Yes, that's
So
from.
is the SARS-CoV-2, the one that causes COVID-19, going to be similar to the first SARS, do you think?
I think from the immunity from a natural infection likely will be the same as what we would get from back in 2003 from the SARS, original SARS infection. I think to add to what Poh Lian has just said, I think the point is that not all vaccines are the same, right? So the flu vaccine, the way that it's made is that you take the flu virus, kill it chemically, and then present it as a vaccine to the immune system. So think of it this way, that what you want the immune system to do is to remember. Now we remember what we see and can feel and can interact with much better than if you just see a picture. So if I ask you to remember a person and I show you a video versus I show you a picture, you probably remember the video more because this person moves, you hear the person, you get to kind of figure out how tall relatively and all that.
You mean the virus is that smart?
Yeah, well, no, our immune system is that smart.
Oh, okay.
Right? Because you want to see, if you see various parts of the life of a virus, then it can target the different parts of the life of the virus. The way flu works is that you just see one part and that's all you see. So then the impact of that on the memory is a lot less than what can be produced from, say, a live infection. And that's why the live vaccine is best, because it simulates the entire process. And I think the mRNA vaccine has a chance of at least simulating some parts of it. Which is why I think we're going to get better durability in terms of immunity, perhaps not lifelong, but better than what we're seeing with flu vaccine.
So not likely to need it every year.
Yeah.
Right. There's so many other questions I want to ask the three of you, because to have an expert here answering questions is fantastic. But our webinar was oversubscribed and we've got more than 200 questions coming in, so I think we should look at some of the questions that have come in. Wu Siu Si is asking, which is the best vaccine for older people? Would anybody like to take? I mean, is it different?
From the clinical trial, there is not a lot of difference comparing older with the younger people. In fact, statistically, there is no difference. the average is lower in the older adults, both Moderna and Pfizer.
Against 95%,
versus
something
95.
like that. Yes.
But if you look at the spread of the data, then they overlap. And once you overlap, scientifically we say there's no true difference.
So it's equally good for older and younger people?
The answer is we don't know, but it works well.
It works well.
It works well, yeah.
But both these are mRNA vaccines?
Yes.
What about the other type? Sinovac is not an mRNA vaccine, for example.
Sinovac has no phase 3 data
It's
just
got
yet.
no phase 3. So we don't know yet.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
So based on the phase 3 data
Yes.
for the Pfizer vaccine, they did enroll, people who are older, up to I think 85 years of age, and that's pretty good actually. The vaccine efficacy looks good in older people.
Right.
So when we look at data, we also look at sort of the number of people. So if the vaccine trial is 43,000 and we've got 21,000 plus in each arm, then
each arm meaning placebo.
yeah, so placebo, so about 21,000
right.
plus who got the vaccine. Then older people will be a subset of that, so it's a smaller number. So obviously, when there's smaller numbers, you have less obviously confidence about the effect. But there is enough data there to say that it's pretty good in older people. And I wouldn't have a hesitation about that.
With people in the 80s and 90s, right?
90s,
The first
yeah.
few people who got the jab, I think one
Yeah.
was 85, one was 90 years
Yeah.
old.
Yes.
So, like Ashish said earlier, safety is paramount. So,
Yes.
older people should not worry about getting the vaccine.
Right.
There is actually some indication that older people may actually even have fewer side effects from the vaccine.
Oh, is it right? Why?
Yes, yes.
Probably because their immune systems are a little bit less active than the younger people. So in a way, when you get that sore arm and that achy feeling, that's really your immune system processing the vaccine. So you shouldn't sort of feel bad. I mean, you might not be happy that you have that sore arm and flu-y feeling, but it actually tells you that your immune system is actually processing it. And for older people, that may actually happen a little bit less, but at the end point of protecting against the disease, they actually were just about as good as other, younger people from the data.
So that's good news for us older people.
Yes.
Melissa Teo is asking, there have been rumors that the mRNA vaccine can modify one's genes. And then, the people are talking about it causing cancer 5-10 years down the line. Is that possible, Mr. mRNA vaccine developer?
In a single answer, no. So genetic information flows from mostly in one direction. So from DNA to RNA to protein, right? So think of it as you have a central library that you cannot bring the book out, but you can only copy the page that you need, right? Say to bake a cake or something like that. So you go into the library, copy the thing, bring it out, then you follow instruction and out you get a cake. The copy that you make is a little bit like Snapchat. It doesn't last. It will fade, right? Now, most of the time, it doesn't flow the other way. RNA cannot become DNA, except if it's some viruses can do it, right? And there's that group of viruses called retroviruses, of which HIV is the most famous. And what they have, these viruses, is that they have two key enzymes, right? And you need them both. If you only have one, it's not going to work also.
Okay.
And these two need to come together. And need to come together with the RNA. So even if you have, by chance have, HIV or other things, that therefore make these enzymes, you also have, in terms of the space in the cell, they need to come together, and that's not easy. So think of it this way: to us, we think the cell is very small, but actually to the RNA, the cell is the size of Singapore. Right, and so if you're the mRNA and you need to find, two other enzymes which are located elsewhere, your chance is actually extremely remote.
So I come in at Toa Payoh, but then one is in Jurong and the other one is at... Yeah.
Exactly, right? So even for HIV, the enzymes need to go with the virus. Without it, only the RNA is not infectious.
Right. So the vaccine itself, because it doesn't have those two enzymes there, and even if your body has them, the chances of it meeting those two enzymes is so low.
Yeah.
Right. So
But the important thing is that the mRNA only lasts less than 48 hours in general.
Oh.
So it's taken up by the body, but the messenger RNA basically gives instructions to make protein, and then the body makes the immune system actually develops the protection. But RNA cannot integrate into the human genome. It actually never gets into the human DNA because our genetic material is DNA, not RNA. So it just, there's no way that the mRNA vaccine can modify, you know, the human
your DNA.
DNA.
So
That's right.
all those
because
messages
the
going
flow of
around.
information in humans
Right.
is
Right.
DNA to RNA
RNA.
to protein.
Yeah, but so
not the other
Not
way.
the other way around.
Right.
Okay,
You
that
can
sounds
go
good.
the other way, but you need those enzymes. That is
Right.
only carried by the HIV, group of
So if you don't have
viruses.
HIV,
No.
you're perfectly safe. If
That's
you
right.
have HIV,
And
you
even
may
if you
still
have,
be safe.
That's right. They need to come together.
Right.
Yeah.
That's very reassuring.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ainan is asking, for those with chronic illnesses like high blood pressure, diabetes, is it better for them to wait or should they get it first because they may be the more vulnerable people?
Well, I think the prioritization groups that we had sort of put together were to start with the people who are highest risk for getting severe disease, as well as, you know, people who are frontliners like healthcare workers and so on. So we're probably going to start with the elderly first, and then we will move down. So if you're, for example, 45 and you have diabetes, then, you know, your group will be a little bit later because, you know, the vaccines are coming in certain
In batches.
amounts. So batches, so we want to make sure that the people who need it the most get it first.
You know, we have a lot of healthcare workers and they're the frontline people. The people who are swabbing travelers coming in are also frontline, so they will get it first, as well as the elderly and the vulnerable. When will the rest of Singapore be able to get it? I mean, we are not talking about maybe it'll be at least, what, 3-4 months down the line at the very earliest?
Well, I think, you know, the Prime Minister has already given assurance that, you know, there's going to be enough purchase to cover, you know, the population, and it should come in by third quarter of 2021. But I think what we will do is sort of do it in stages. So, you know, in a way, we all have to wait our turn, and that's okay because, you know, we are trying to maintain the safe distancing, safe management, and trying to be as careful as possible, you know, opening up our borders. But it makes sense to give it to the people who are highest risk for getting infected.
Yes.
Because they're the ones who go home and they might have an elderly parent. So in a way, you know, by protecting that person from getting infected, you're protecting others whom they come in contact with who might have just medical conditions.
Yep. So the rest of us who are not at high risk should let those who need it more get it first.
Yes.
And then we'll just queue up and wait our turn.
Yes.
Very good. Somebody is asking, if you take one vaccine, right, and then later on you find out this vaccine doesn't protect you for life, but there's another vaccine that comes along. This is somebody called Vishu, right, who comes along, and then there's a better vaccine that gives you lifelong immunity, but you've already had one vaccine. If you were to take the second one, will you get the same benefits?
Yes.
You will.
Yes.
Okay, so not a problem. If you take the not so good one first, you can still take a better one later.
Yep.
Very good. Very short answer. Amy Ko is asking, who are likely to get anaphylactic reactions? Is there any way to predict that someone may get such a reaction?
Well, we think that people who have had a history of anaphylactic reactions may be at higher risk, which is why right now we're recommending that people with a known history of anaphylaxis hold back until we get more information because the vaccines are being rolled out around the world. Certainly if someone had anaphylaxis to the first dose of vaccine, they will not be getting the second dose.
Right.
So that part is straightforward.
Right. Then Jess Lim is saying, I read reports of cases of Bell's palsy after taking the vaccine. Is this a real risk? Is this really the case? I mean,
Yeah. Bell's palsy is basically a condition where there is a paralysis of the facial nerve. It happens in the population on a sporadic basis. Sometimes it can happen with viral infections. So there is, with all of these kinds of things that can happen after vaccination, we have to figure out what the baseline rate is. So if you took 100 people at the bus stop and you asked them, you know, how have you ever had this? You know, you would have to figure out the baseline rate and then figure out after you get the vaccine, if this happens, how much is this above the baseline? So it's almost like a subtraction, right? To account for the difference. So when we look at the data, this was discussed, then it was not entirely clear whether the Bell's palsy cases were above baseline rate, what you'd expect to see just
Right.
sporadically.
So the person may have gotten it with or without the vaccine and has
Correct.
nothing to do with the vaccine.
But because you got the vaccine, you are likely to look at everything and think, it's called recall bias, you know. If a black cat crossed your path, you know,
and
you
then
would
something
worry.
bad happens to you,
Yes,
you say
you
it's
tend to
the
think
black cat.
that, yes.
But
yeah.
it could have happened anyway.
Right.
Right. You know, we've got a lot of questions on allergies. People are asking if I've got peanut allergy. Should I not take the vaccine? If I'm allergic to seafood and other things, should I not take the vaccine?
So we're saying that if people have mild allergies, so if it's a little bit of a rash or an itch, then that's probably nothing to worry about. We recognize that allergies are very common, but certainly serious allergies where they get anaphylaxis, where they swell up around the face, eyes, mouth, if they have trouble breathing, that's a serious allergy. We're asking them to hold off on getting the vaccine.
So they should wait a while.
Yes.
And then, so any allergies, go to the back of the line.
No,
just in
not any
case.
allergies,
Yeah.
serious allergies.
So you could be allergic to peanuts. Some would be mild allergies. Some would be serious. So the person themselves should know, or should they
Yes.
talk to their doctor and ask?
Yeah, I mean, they will be filling out forms and they can talk to the doctor or nurse, you know, but in general, I mean, I think people do know when they have a serious allergy, if they've had to go to the emergency room or use an EpiPen, those are considered serious.
allergies,
And we are
right.
asking people to hold off. But if you've just got a mild itch or rash, you know,
Yeah.
you can probably proceed with the vaccine.
You know, this is beginning to sound a bit like we're in a consultation
Yep.
room with a doctor. But
Yes.
someone's asking, what happens if the vaccine deteriorates due to the cold chain being broken? Maybe Ashish, you can take this one. Apparently there was flu vaccination in South Korea that caused death because it was not kept properly. So how dangerous is
Well,
that?
I mean, I think, you know, vaccines are biologics and they're very, very temperature sensitive. And if you look at some of the recently approved vaccines, they have different temperature stability requirements. And I think that, you know, if there's a violation and if there's a fluctuation of temperature during transportation or from the time of transportation to the point of administration, I think clearly then appropriate steps need to be taken to use alternate product and not use any vaccines where there is a compromise in their temperature stability transportation conditions.
But is there any way for you to know that by the time it came to Singapore, something could have happened in between? Is there any way to follow up? Do pharmaceutical companies ensure that the entire cold chain is...
Very much so. I think ensuring that the cold chain is not compromised is a very critical part of the distribution logistics supply chain process. And if you look at some of the recently approved products, companies have done a tremendous amount of work to ensure that the robustness of the distribution process stays intact. So there are very clear checks and balances along the way to ensure that there is no compromise on the storage conditions alongside the transportation conditions from the point that it leaves the manufacturing plant to the point it gets to the healthcare provider's office. Right.
So if anything happens at the healthcare provider's office, they would know about it and they should junk that. If you come in one day and your fridge has, you forgot to switch it on and everything has defrosted, throw the vaccine away.
Yes. So remember, you know, we give vaccines day in, day out, year in, year out, and there are these safety and quality checks in place. So the cold chain management is very much a part of the normal process. So, for example, when I run the Travelers Health and Vaccination Clinic at TTSH, you know, there are fridges and they are temperature controlled and there are actually records about temperature excursions. And it is hooked up to an alarm so that if it actually departs from that, you know, the fridge breaks down, the electricity goes off, you will actually have a record of that. And we actually have thrown away vaccines when it exceeded the temperature excursion because, you know, the fridge broke down, for example, you know. So that's part of the commitment that we make to safety and quality. And there's no reason to think that this would be any different for COVID vaccines because there's so much more attention to this.
Right.
And that's also very much in line with the commitment we make as the biopharmaceutical industry to ensure that safety and quality is not compromised from the point of manufacture to the point of dissemination.
You will have to, right? Because the reputation of the pharmaceutical companies are at stake if things like that happen.
Well, I mean, clearly, if there is a compromise on temperature, it affects safety, affects efficacy. You know, it could have tremendous impact. And so I think the controls are very stringent, and that's part of our commitment to safety and science.
Right. Someone wants to know, Singapore has bought pre-bought 3 vaccines. Will they be allowed to choose which one they want to use?
So right now there's only one available,
Yes.
so that's sort of a moot question. And we will only be using vaccines which are approved by HSA, or in this case, authorized by HSA. It's an interim authorization as the companies move towards applying for final registration or full registration. So when we look at the vaccines, the expert committee will make recommendations because we will actually look at the data to see whether it's more appropriate or more helpful for certain segments of the population. So in a way, although people want to have a choice, the complexity of the medical information is such that we're going to have to make medical recommendations as to who gets what. And certainly at the very beginning when the vaccines are being used under what we call the pandemic special access route, which is at MOH's direction.
Right, so no choice. You take what you're
We will
given.
choose what the experts say
Right.
because the information is very complex.
Right.
Yeah, it will have to depend on the data. I don't think, it's not like we're shopping for a watch or something like that where we can pick what we like. I mean, at the end of the day, the vaccine needs to do something in the body. And that basically very much depends on the science and the data. So I think, as Poh Lian said, all that we'll have to await the data.
No, but supposing we've got, say, Singapore's negotiating for some more. So assuming we've got 5 vaccines available and we've got 100,000 doses of each of those 5. One gives you 95% protection, one gives you 80% protection, right? But I've already bought 100,000 of those vaccines. So do I have to make sure that I use those, or do I give everybody the better ones? What would the expert committee go on this, for? Would you give the low-risk people the lower protection vaccine?
I think at the end of the day, it depends on many things besides just efficacy. The safety profile, the side effects, the cost, how many doses, and so on. So at the end of the day, you all this comes into play when you make a decision. And I suspect that, if let's say the cost is very high, and given that this vaccine is going to be paid for by the government, given free, then it really depends on how much Singapore is willing to put on the vaccine, right? And which ones they would buy for their population. I think at the end of the day, but I think that's a moot point because looking at the data, there's no difference between the front runners. Between Pfizer and Moderna, data looks very much the same.
Right.
I would say that, when you look at the front runners, right, both of them are quite equivalent, both Pfizer and Moderna, from the data that's been released, publicly. Looks like it's about 95% efficacious. And because they're similar vaccines, mRNA vaccines, probably safety will be fairly similar. A lot of the questions that people ask about one vaccine will be asked of the other. I think given the way things are now, when there's so much information out there, of course, if a vaccine was 80% versus 95%, most people would want the 95% effective vaccine. And I think, as experts, we would always want to give the best for the patient. So if the government has bought it, or pre-purchased it, then it makes sense to use the best ones available. And I think, at the end of the day, we want the best protection for Singaporeans, right? So obviously, that's sort of a no-brainer that you want to use the best product you have.
Right, because that gives the society better immunity as well, right? Not just the individual.
Yeah, and it's also the confidence that, people want to know that they're getting the best available.
Right, Eng Eong?
Yeah, so I was going to say that, what we're seeing now is data from a very controlled trial. The efficacy is from a controlled trial. At the end of the day, what we want is effectiveness. That we don't know yet. And
what's the difference between efficacy and effectiveness?
Yeah, so in a clinical trial, you're saying, okay, here is how I'm going to do the trial, 2 doses. Now, if you don't follow, if you for some reason you say I don't want to take the second dose, then that's removed from analysis. right? So whereas in the real life, you cannot remove that person from saying, okay, you know, that person's not a
Doesn't
Singaporean,
count, right?
right?
Yes.
So you have to take everything into account. And that's where, you know, the affordability, the side effects, whether or for whatever reason, you know, if you use one vaccine that requires 2 doses and for some reason people are not coming back for the second dose, the effectiveness is going to drop.
But will there be some protection? I mean, if I took one and I don't
we
take
don't
the
know.
second.
We don't know right at this stage. Yeah. So, you know, at the end of the day, it's a lot more complex than that. There are a lot of other forces at play. So it's not just the efficacy, but many other things.
Right. Okay, we've got a question here. You've partially answered it. You know, they're asking, can patients undergoing kidney dialysis or cancer treatments take the vaccine? You say it doesn't affect cancer, but if they're in the middle of a treatment, getting chemotherapy and things like that, should they wait? Should they take the vaccine? Which?
Yeah.
I would say wait.
We are saying the expert committee has deliberated on this,
Right.
and basically right now the data are still coming in. So we're saying wait to pregnant women, to children under 16, and immunocompromised persons. So someone going through cancer chemotherapy will probably have decreased effectiveness of the vaccine anyway. And what we want to do is make sure that people around them are vaccinated. So everyone who's eligible should get the vaccine, because we actually want to protect people who either can't get it, or even if they got it, they might not get as much benefit from the vaccine.
Right. Could you just explain a little bit more? Who are immunocompromised? Who is this group of immunocompromised patients?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what happens is that immunocompromise is actually a spectrum.
Right.
So it's not like saying you are immunocompromised, you're not. So there are also different types of immunocompromise. So for example, someone with leukemia, which is a blood kind of cancer,
yes.
they would be clearly immunocompromised. But if they were treated for leukemia, say, a year ago, are they still immunocompromised? Well, it's probably a spectrum as you recover, right, from chemotherapy. Someone who's a solid organ transplant, you know, that's clear immunocompromise, and they continue to take medicines that prevent them from rejecting the transplant.
So anyone who's had a transplant, don't take the vaccine?
Well, for now, we're saying
don't take the
they may be
vaccine, right.
at increased risk for the disease, but because the data are still coming in, we would like them to wait until we
Right.
get more data.
Okay,
So
who
everyone else that's eligible should get it.
Right.
to
So all
protect
the
them.
people around them should get it to protect the one who's immunocompromised.
As according to their groups, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So who else is immunocompromised? Transplant
HIV patients
HIV
with CD4s less than 200, people who are on medicines like steroids, very large doses of steroids like prednisone. There are a bunch of medications that our rheumatologic colleagues use. So people with lupus, people with rheumatoid arthritis, some of those medications can be immunosuppressive.
Autoimmune disease?
For autoimmune diseases, there's some immunosuppression that's needed to control the autoimmune disease.
Because we have Lim Guek
Yes.
asking those with
Yes.
autoimmune disease.
Yes, but again, even with the medications, there are dose ranges. So for example, someone who's taking 40 milligrams of prednisone, that's immunocompromising. If someone is taking 5, we consider that much less immunocompromised.
And for them, is it because the vaccine is bad for them, or because of their condition, the vaccine doesn't work well for them?
Again, when you say immunocompromised, then you're talking about the entire range.
Right.
So we need then to get data for each specific segment. So you would actually have to look at the data for dialysis patients, for kidney transplants, for leukemics. And in that group of 21,000 plus that got the vaccine, to slice and dice it, the numbers get much smaller.
Right.
So I think we're just going to have to wait for that data to come in. We are certainly as interested as everyone else who's asking us questions. So we will be looking for that information as quickly as we can.
So, immunocompromised people are not doesn't mean that. Sorry, let me rephrase. It doesn't mean that just because you're immunocompromised, therefore you cannot receive any form of vaccine. In fact, there are some form of vaccines you want to use, like pneumococcal and all that, because these are just proteins, right? So they're quite relatively
It's a different
harmless.
type of vaccine.
Yeah.
Right.
For mRNA, the issue is this, that it doesn't spread, right? What you put in is all there is. The one that we are developing is the one that would expand. But nonetheless, the part of the safety, theoretically, is that we have the ability to get rid of this. So the mRNA has its own half-life, but even if it doesn't go away, our immune system is going to get rid of the cell anyway, right? Now, if you are immunocompromised and you cannot do that, then of course, theoretically, there could be a small safety risk that you cannot get rid of this mRNA.
You know, the COVID-19 vaccines, there are different types. So our mRNA ones are one type, but there are different types. Do you have this, is the response the same for everybody? I mean, for the different types of vaccine, or are there some types of vaccines that may be safer for people who cannot take the mRNA vaccine?
Right. So if let's say you compare between mRNA vaccine and say Sinovac, which is take the whole virus, kill it, and then that's all there is, right? Then of course the inactivated version Sinovac will be safer than mRNA, because mRNA, there's a process that's going to happen inside the body, right? Now, having said that, I don't think that that same risk is equivalent to, say, using a live vaccine. Live vaccine clearly is going to cause an infection. Now, if you have an immunocompromised state, that's going to be dangerous.
Right.
So, but beyond safety, the quality of the immune response is going to be different too. Like I said, you're showing a picture versus you're showing a video. You remember the video better than you remember the picture, right? And not only that, but I think one of the reasons why the mRNA vaccine is good is because the spike protein is made inside the body. So once the protein is made, you get antibody response. But as the spike protein is being made, that's what the T cell is going to see. So one is seeing the virus outside of the cell, one is seeing inside of the cell. And whereas if you just present a killed virus, it's not going to get into the cell. So all you see is the outside version. You're not seeing what's happening inside, I see. Right? So I think that although there is, maybe the risk is high, or at least the safety concern may be higher with mRNA vaccine versus a inactivated or just a protein, but the benefits are clearly better, right? Because you get both arms of the immune response now targeting a single virus.
Right. I'm going to throw this at you, Ashish, but somebody is asking, why are we accepting a vaccine that gives only 95% protection? Aren't we going to wait for one that gives you 100% protection? So can you tell us, vaccines, what is the range of protection generally,
I think that's probably an area that I think is best responded to by my fellow experts on the panel.
Well, the FDA set a pretty, low bar. They would consider things above 50%.
So 95% is way over their bar.
Yes, that is, as I said before, it's like two people on an unfamiliar green hitting a hole in one on the first go. So, if you look at the vaccines that I use, for example, in travel clinic, vaccines, the effectiveness of vaccines depends upon the patient as well. So when we talk about flu vaccine, because most people are familiar with that, the range of effectiveness in a good year is about 70 to 90%. So if I gave it to a 25-year-old doctor, it would be maybe 90% effective in preventing flu. If I gave it to that doctor's grandmother who was 70, it might be 70%. If I gave it to someone who actually was 70 and was on prednisone, it might be lower, like 50% effective, right? So we already accept things like that, but even regular vaccines that we use, like typhoid vaccine, that's 70%.
That's 70%, so this is higher.
Oh yeah, this is great. Hepatitis B is 95%.
Right.
And hepatitis B is given to every single person that's born in Singapore as a childhood vaccine. So in a way, when you look at 95%, that is actually pretty amazing for the first registered COVID vaccine.
In such a short period of time.
In such a short period of time. It really is a hole-in-one. But we are going to have to see what it's like in effectiveness when the population takes it.
Would the effectiveness be lower than efficacy?
Maybe not. It depends on the uptake rate, how people are compliant, and all that. But coming back to this question of 95, whether we can this 100%, we will never get 100%. The reason is because immunity is not absolute. What I mean is that we tend to think of it as yes, no. It's not that. It's the amount. So you can always overwhelm the immune system. So, for instance, on a normal exposure to coronavirus, even if someone's really coughing a lot, you might get, say, 1,000 viruses. You will inhale 1,000 viruses into your airway. And that's what normally your immune system will have to tackle. Now, if for whatever reason you somehow can purify this to, say, 10 million viruses, and you jab that into someone's airway, it will break through. Even if you're immune to a normal infection, you will still come down with disease at this point in time, because it's about how much you're exposed to, right? So you can always break through. So there's no such thing as 100%, because there's a lot of diversity. Well, although most of us may be exposed to, say, 1,000 viruses if we come in contact with someone with COVID-19, there may be others may be exposed to, say, 10,000 viruses. Then the outcome is completely different. But on average, the efficacy is 95%, which is great.
Actually, could you explain?
But I want to make one point.
Right.
If you don't take the vaccine, it's 0% effective.
Yes.
Exactly.
So you can't let the best be the enemy of the good.
Right.
If you sit there waiting for Mr. Perfect to come along,
You'll never get married.
you'll never get married. And you're not Miss Perfect either.
And I think the point that is
Yes.
being made is really important, because as you think about what countries need to do to really get that protection and to get the world economy back on its feet again, is this whole issue of vaccine hesitancy,
Yes.
right? And if you think about what happened recently with what the industry did, partnering with academia, partnering with government, partnering with each other to bring the first vaccine candidates in less than a year, I think the whole issue of raising vaccine confidence is going to require all hands on deck approach, right? So a really robust, well thought through approach on raising vaccine confidence around the world is going to be a very critical enabler to the world economy getting back and humming again.
Actually, I think most people here are quite keen to have the vaccine. And the hesitancy, I think, comes from the fact that the new vaccine, mRNA vaccine, is so new. There are no other vaccines that use that particular technology, and then it came up so quickly. And I think that's the reason some people are a bit worried.
If you think of it this way, right? Although we are delivering the gene as an mRNA, we actually have been using RNA as vaccines for a long time.
Oh.
And that is because a lot of the live virus vaccine that we use contains RNA, right? So it's the genome getting into the cell, and then they replicate, and that's how our immune system then sees it and then attacks it, right? And then develop that memory. So, for instance, one of the best vaccines in the world, yellow fever vaccine, is an RNA virus. And if you take out the RNA genome and you just show the shell of the virus, it's not going to be as good. So you need the RNA, and the RNA has been in man for a long time. So, yellow fever is an RNA virus. Measles, mumps, rubella, live influenza, they are all RNA, and we've actually been exposed to a lot of RNA viruses in our lifetime.
Well, what's the difference with the M in front?
Okay. So the M basically distinguishes the kind of RNA. So in our bodies, we have many different kinds of RNA. The mRNA, the M stands for messenger.
Yes.
So it's carrying the gene, the code of the gene from the nucleus into the cell cytoplasm, and then it instructs the cell what kind of protein to make. Now, in the virus, we change this around. We call it positive strand RNA. The reason why that is, and in effect, it is mRNA. Why we call it positive strand is because there are multiple genes on that strand. mRNA only has one gene.
Oh, okay.
Right? So we call it positive strand. In effect, it's exactly the same thing. It does the same thing.
So it's not that new a technology.
Now, in terms of the
With the M in front, it's a bit newer.
right,
but-
right. Delivering the vaccine in this way is new, but in terms of, if you think of the biology is not new.
And that's why there's so many companies coming up with this
Right.
particular. So it's not developed overnight because
Right.
of COVID-19.
Right. The challenge has always been, how do you deliver it to the cell?
Right.
Right, because RNA is not stable. In fact, and that's why
It doesn't last very long.
Yes.
You were saying 48 hours.
Yeah, less than 48, and that's even after they've worked on it.
Yeah.
So the point is that, when you get a real infection, you're getting the whole virus, RNA and all.
Yeah. In
So
fact,
people don't seem to think about that,
Right.
they're like, they want natural immunity.
You see, we are not scientists, so we don't know. You see. So you're saying that this
so
is just
my analogy has always been no
Right.
Singaporean parent in their right mind would send their kid through PSLE without making them do some 10-year series papers. So in a sense, when you get the infection, you're getting the real thing,
Right.
virus and RNA and all. Whereas when you get the vaccine, you've prepared the body to know how to deal with it. It's like helping your child prepare for PSLE by doing a few papers beforehand, rather than sending that poor kid in completely naive.
So mRNA is the PSLE 10-year series.
I think so.
something like that, yes.
Thank you so much, everyone. We are running a bit out of time. I found this not just interesting, but highly educational. But before we wrap up this session, could I just ask each of you if there's something you would like to say to our audience or advice you want to give them? Maybe we'll start with Ashish and then work our way this way.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's been an honor to be with my fellow panelists on the topic of our times. I think as SAPI, we represent over 35 innovative biopharmaceutical companies. We're very proud of what we have done in contributing and partnering with the government. We are over 5% of Singapore's GDP. And I think what we've accomplished as member companies over the last 9 months is testament to the agility and the innovation and the collaboration that our industry is capable of. We're very excited about what the future holds. We continue to focus on our principles of science first, and we look forward to continuing to partner with the government, with academia, with other companies to really ensure we've got the right policy stability and coherency so that we can bring more of our innovation to Singaporeans and beyond.
Well, we look forward to better treatments from your members. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. Poh Lian, anything you would like to add?
Well, thank you for having us, Salma. I'd say that, I'm usually cautious and I like to hang back. I'm not a super early adopter. But when you look at the vaccine efficacy data, an HSA review has been extremely meticulous and detailed, and so has the US FDA and other places. And we on the expert committee have really scrutinized the data. Because, look at it, I'm a doctor, I'm going to be one of the first groups to get jabbed. And, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So, we want to look at this because, it's our families, it's ourselves, it's people we care about on the line.
Right.
So we would not recommend it unless we felt it was effective and safe and good quality.
So you will take the vaccine?
I would take the vaccine. And as soon as it gets offered to me or my group, okay. But the point is that we are all struggling with the COVID disruption, and if there was any way to get our community and our country and the world back to normal, this is one of the first steps. It's a journey of 1,000 miles because we have to get everyone in the world vaccinated, and we're really only as strong as our weakest link. But if this is what it takes to help our jobs and travel and just life get back to some semblance of normality, then I think we need everyone to just have that confidence that we can move forward together. So, the best minds in the world have worked on this, and we've paid good money for the vaccines, and we've looked at it as hard as we can. So all that work and all that resource, should not go to waste. And if we don't use the vaccines, there are shelf lives, right? It's like buying something and not eating it. You're just leaving it in the fridge.
Expiry date, yes.
There is an expiry date. So we're not going to force people to do it. We really want people to trust the system. But if you look at it, most of the vaccines, as Minister Gan said, are not mandatory, right? They're not compulsory. And yet, in Singapore, there's a lot of trust in the system. The parents take their kids to get vaccinated. So we're hoping that that same trust will apply here. We have really done our due diligence and our homework. We've worked very hard. The government's making it taking affordability out of the question by making it free for not just Singaporeans but also long-term residents. So we think that this is really important, and we want everyone to please think about getting the vaccine, not just for yourself, but because you need to protect people around you.
Well, I'm always all for vaccines because I believe protection is always better than cure.
And no one is safe until everyone's safe.
That's true. But
Yes.
does that mean by Q3, when everybody has had a chance to be vaccinated, life can revert to normal? I mean,
Well,
why
it will
not?
depend on
Yes.
what's happening outside the country as
No,
well.
but we're all protected. So even if people come in with COVID,
It's not 100%.
true, but you're not likely to have an epidemic with the majority of people
Yeah, so
protected.
we'll just have to wait and see. I think everyone wants to get back to normal, so we'll just move as cautiously as we can, one step at a time. And we're going to wait on the data and the science and the evidence. So one
Right.
step at a time.
So it's not just what's happening in Singapore; it's also what's happening in the world that
Yeah.
matters.
Yeah.
Eng Eong, any other anything else to add?
Oh, well, thanks for having me on this panel. And I think, beyond COVID and all that, I think we need this dialogue, right, between those in science and medicine and pharmacy and all that with the public. And I think one of the reasons why I'm reminded of this talk I was at just last year, where the speaker is saying that at the next epidemic, we will have to fight both the virus as well as the misinformation. And I think whilst we are very engaged in fighting the virus, we as scientists and doctors perhaps can do a lot more in fighting the misinformation. And I think, at the end of the day, as Poh Lian said, the decision to vaccinate or not rests with the person, not
Yes.
with someone forcing them to do what they don't want. But that decision should be made based on information rather than misinformation. And I think that there's a role for all of us, and therefore a forum like this that to engage this
I think
conversation.
WHO calls it infodemics.
Yeah.
Instead of an epidemic of misinformation. Could I, before we end this one, could I ask you what's happening with your particular vaccine?
So we've kept to timeline. So
Right.
we've actually finished dosing everyone in a phase 1/2 trial.
Right.
We're now going to go to the next stage. Now, obviously, once you have 2 vaccines that could be licensed for use, it changes how we should think about our next stage. And we're making some strategic modification. Hopefully, in the next few weeks, you'll hear some news on what the next stage will
So I'll
look
keep
like.
my fingers crossed for you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So thank you again very much for all for such an interesting conversation. We've come to the end of today's webinar, the A to Z of COVID-19 vaccines. I hope our audience have found this session as stimulating as I have. I'm Salma Khalid. Goodbye and stay safe.